Golden MSA varnishes are made thicker than what is needed for brush application. In this video, we'll show how to properly thin the MSA varnish to our standard brush applied recommendation. To open the container, firmly press on the sides of the plastic safety cap. Inside, you'll see a metal disc that ensures safe shipping of the product. This disc can be rather difficult to remove. The easiest way to accomplish this is with a screwdriver and a hammer. Gently tap the screwdriver through the metal disc and use the hole to pry out the disc. Be sure to close containers when not in use. To cleanly pour the MSA varnish, pour the varnish and use the lip of the mixing container to catch any drips. Wipe the varnish from the threads with a paper towel. Allow all varnish or solvent-saturated materials to fully dry before disposing. After you have poured out the desired amount of varnish, mark the varnish level with a permanent marker. Next, divide the varnish amount into 3 parts. Then, make another mark, indicating the amount of solvent to add. Add the solvent to the mark, creating a 3:1 ratio. Begin stirring with a palette knife. A slight amount of initial turbidity between the varnish and solvent is to be expected. Stir for at least 1 minute or until the mixture clarifies. Once the mixture is homogeneous, cap and label the container. You're now ready to varnish. A basic introduction to applying MSA varnish onto a smooth acrylic surface. Previous Golden videos about the brush application of an isolation coat and proper thinning of the MSA varnish are worth reviewing if you haven't done so already. The scale of which you are varnishing determines the kind of brush you'll need. For this demonstration, we'll use a 3.5-inch synthetic bristle brush readily found at most hardware stores and home centers. The requirements for a good varnish brush are bristles with a good springy memory, a brush shape that is wide, flat, and thin, and larger brushes should have flagged or split bristles. Other brushes may be used, such as an artist varnishing brush, but they may require additional thinning and are better suited for smaller works. We pour the previously thinned MSA varnish mat into a shallow tray because it provides more control than just dipping the brush into a mixing jar. Notice only about 1/3 of the brush is loaded with varnish. This provides additional control during brushing. Although this test painting is fairly small, we want to initially focus on getting the varnish onto the surface, and not how evenly it's being applied. By continuously loading up the brush with varnish and applying it into various areas of the painting, we make it easier to smooth out later on. Now that there is enough varnish to cover the entire painting, we can begin spreading it further using long, deliberate strokes. MSA varnish dries slowly, allowing us to slow down and focus on getting a nice uniform finish. After brushing out the center area first, the brush should have enough varnish to coat the edges. This technique of starting at the edge and brushing inward reduces the chance of product flowing over the edge of the surface. This also helps to adjust the amount of product in the central area if a bit too much varnish was applied. While we continue covering the edges, let's talk about the importance of good studio lighting. Always varnish with lighting that allows you to easily see the product being applied. Good lighting and a proper viewing angle increases the chance of a uniform application and also helps to spot loose brush hairs or whatever else finds its way into your varnish. As the edges are coated, we can finally focus on unifying the entire layer of varnish. Using minimal pressure on the brush, brush from one end to the other, slightly lifting as we approach the edge. At this stage, the brush barely touches the surface. Pressing any harder can result in brush strokes remaining in the dried varnish film. If you notice a lot of brush drag, it may indicate that the varnish is either too thick or the brush is too soft. When varnishing, the idea is to get the product on at a uniform thickness and allow plenty of time for the brush strokes and bubbles to dissipate from the film. Here is a close-up of the freshly applied MSA varnish. Notice how it appears somewhat irregular and there are a lot of bubbles. Fortunately, MSA varnish has excellent leveling and upon drying should develop into a uniform finish. For this removal process, we will need good ventilation, nitrile gloves, a shallow tray, full strength 100% pure mineral spirits, pieces of lint-free soft cotton or cotton poly cloth, a plastic bucket, and 4 or 6 mil polyplastic sheeting. This smooth acrylic painting is a great test piece for us to learn about the varnish removal procedure. An isolation coat was applied to the painting before the varnish layer, so there is little risk of pigment moving during this process. We begin by saturating the cloth with 100% pure mineral spirits. Weaker solvents will not remove the varnish. The cloth should be saturated with solvent, but does not need to be sopping wet, so we wring it out gently and lay it onto the painting surface. Smooth the cloth evenly, removing any air pockets from between the varnish and cloth. Then cover the cloth with plastic sheeting. The plastic slows the solvent evaporation during the reactivation process. Allow 2 to 5 minutes for the varnish layer to be reactivated by the solvent. Here, we are checking the progress by lifting up a corner of the plastic and cloth. Any tackiness means the varnish has not been completely liquefied, so the cloth is laid back down and given a couple of minutes longer before we recheck it. After 3 more minutes, the solvent in the cloth has done its job of reactivating the varnish layer and is removed. We repeat the process in the same area with a fresh piece of solvent-saturated cloth. This removal procedure allows the solvent to continue the reactivation of the varnish layer. It's important to avoid any aggressive rubbing that can cause damage to the artwork. A cloth is applied to the wet surface and smoothed out. Immediately can be removed, and it should take a good amount of the varnish with it. As the cloth is pulled up, inspect it for signs of pigment lift. If you see any, clean up excess varnish and stop the varnish process immediately. The cloth is folded into quarters with the varnish side inward and is used to carefully wipe the surface, removing any remaining varnish. Now it's time to remove the rest of the varnish from the painting. We're speeding it up for the sake of time. However, the process is exactly the same as before. If you are not the artist who created the painting, do not attempt removing the varnish. Consult a painting conservator instead. If the varnish remains sticky for a long time and seems resistant to removal, it may be that the solvent isn't strong enough or the varnish layer is very thick. Long contact times of mineral spirits to the acrylic surface may increase the chance for damage, so if you have attempted the varnish removal of a section without success, allow it to dry and contact Golden's technical support for advice. The solvent-soaked cloth and leftover solvent should be handled and disposed of carefully. Never pour the solvent down the drain. Small quantities can be allowed to evaporate. Larger quantities can be saved for reuse or treated as hazardous waste. The cloth should be allowed to dry completely in a well-ventilated area before disposal. After completing the process in the last section, gently wipe the entire painting one last time. While wiping, feel the surface for any tacky areas and also visually inspect it as well. Once we have removed all the varnish, all that's left to do is allow a few hours for the mineral spirits to completely evaporate.